sharing with each other, and I hope that some folks are able to hang out after and continue those conversations, and also I'd love to learn from you as well. I'm gonna keep it moving, just because time is linear. And talk to you a little bit about the work that's going on in the Northeast to address some of these historical injustices, and how you can get involved. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the Northeast Farmers of Color. I know we have some members in the room. You know, we started out just because we were kind of lonely. Like, being a farmer in the rural Northeast, especially as a person of color, is isolating and it can be lonely. So we started having some winter potlucks back in 2017 to build relationships and mutual support. And it pretty quickly emerged that there was more that was needed in addition to those relationships. There's 220 plus of us in the Northeast. So the Northeast Farmers of Color decided to formalize a little bit in terms of thinking about how do we support our members in accessing land, accessing quality jobs, technical support, and so forth. So this is trying to show you like what territories we're on. I'm just gonna skip. But there's at least a dozen indigenous communities whose territories we farm on, most of us as laborers, not landowners. So it includes the lands of Mohican, Abenaki, Akwesasne, Nipmuc, Mohegan, Wampanoag, Wabanaki Confederacy, and others. And a big part of, as we formalize the work, and I'll get into this a bit more later in strategies, has been to attempt to build relationships of deference and respect and support with each of the communities upon whose lands we occupy. Oh, okay. Now it's coming. There we go. There's its pictures. Stephanie made that slide. It's fancier than mine. I was like, it's moving. There we are. This is us. So just recently, the Northeast Farmers of Color went from having an interim council structure and interim governance to electing a board of directors. And so we're very grateful to those folks who've decided to serve from all across the Northeast and to help us build the institutional infrastructure that's necessary to do land transfer. A lot of our work, we half joke that it's about fitting these indigenous concepts and decolonized concepts into white man's law. So like, how do we translate what we want to do into this legal structure that we've inherited? So of course we continue to have our mutual aid gatherings, and these have extended even beyond the Northeast. We had some mutual aid gatherings with other grassroots farmers in Puerto Rico, in Mexico, and elsewhere. But we do believe that to have a decolonized framework, relationships need to be foundational to all of the work that we do, authentic relationships and connection, as well as continuing to share our knowledge and support one another. Many people in our network might not know, how do you create a solid contract with a landowner that you're gonna run your business on, or how do you create fair leases with other members of your co-op? And so there's a lot of skill shares that we have where we're supporting one another in our projects. That's another picture of Skillshare. So talking a little bit about the reparations work of NEFO, I'll tell you a story. I mean, you're all here because obviously you have some interest in reparations, so you may not need convincing. But one of my mentors and elders, Baba Ed Whitfield, tells this really powerful story. He said, imagine if your neighbor came over to your farm and stole your cow. Like everybody, no question, everyone saw it. It was caught on security cameras. Like there's no question, your cow was definitely stolen. And then a couple weeks later, this neighbor comes over, with tears in his eyes and remorse in his heart, being like, that really sucked that I took your cow. I'm so sorry, but I want to make it up to you. So every week for the rest of the cow's life, I'm going to give you half a pound of butter. I don't know about y'all, but I'd be like, and the cow? Like, can I get the cow back? And unfortunately, that's sort of the way that we sometimes treat our thinking around reparations. It's like, well, we all know this land was all taken, and we all know there was like at least $6.4 trillion of stolen labor, but like we don't really want to give it back because we like it and having all that stuff that we didn't earn. So like maybe we could just give you a scholarship to a land-grant university instead, right? And I think that fundamentally we have to think about, we just have to think about what it means to give the cow back. What does that really look like? And even it's challenging, like I consider myself pretty radical, and I'm like, what would it really mean for me to submit to the governance of the Stockbridge, Muncie, and Mohican people, and their decision about how land works and ownership works. Not up to me, but really up to the community that originally stewarded the land. So, good reflection questions. You who care about reparations are not alone. The United Nations agrees with you. They've had more than one commission study and come to the conclusion that there's absolutely no doubt that we as a society owe reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans. There have been many calculations ranging from $6.4 to $47 trillion of the dollar value of that stolen labor and exclusion. And the way that we are certainly working really hard as the Northeast Farmers of Color Network to convince the government to give over reparations. In fact, we've been meeting with Elizabeth Warren, and her new platform includes reparations of land for Indigenous and Black people, which
yes,
right? And in the meantime, there are ways to do what we call micro-reparations. So micro-reparations is that person to person, I know that I have some wealth or some land that isn't truly mine, and I'm gonna figure out how to share that. And a tool that we created is called the Reparations Map. It is a very simple matchmaking tool where Black and brown farmers and earth keepers put their projects on and their needs, and anybody can see it and they can donate those resources. And we've had over 30 projects receive substantial amounts of money and sometimes even property through the Reparations Map, which is really exciting, including an Indigenous school, an Akwesasne school, as well as an Indigenous eco-village in Florida, an immigrant-owned farm in Chicago, a Black-owned farm called the Harriet Tubman Farm in North Carolina. These are examples. Okay, I forgot to put them up here. So this is the Harriet Tubman Farm. My sibling Steve running that. This is a Lawns of Garden project in New Haven that's brought over 40 home gardens to people living under food apartheid. The Mama Tingo co-op that brings together, talk about connections across divides, but Haitian and Dominican people on the border to farm together. Nikki Presley, who saved her family's land from getting sold out from under them and started a farm. This is a youth cooking project, an Indigenous-owned food distribution program in Chicago, and so forth. And anybody can jump on it today. So that's a really nice, what to do next kind of thing. We're so excited about the Reparations Map that decided it was important to create an organization, like a legal entity, that could receive land donations and redistribute them. For various reasons, it can be challenging for an individual to give land over to another individual without a nonprofit intermediary or easements and blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. And so, as Frantz Fanon said, for a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land. The land will bring them bread and, above all, dignity. So the vision with the land trust is permanent, secure land tenure. Note that we don't say ownership, because the cool thing about a land trust is that as much as you can get in white man's law, land is not owned by a land trust. A deed is held in common, adhering to the guidelines of a public interest. It's not actually privately owned, which is important to us. And it's not just the control of the land that we're seeking, but control of the land for the use of sustainable farming, ceremony, cultural preservation, and so forth. And the justification at this point hopefully should be obvious, but while nationally over 98% of farmland is controlled by white people, if you can believe it, it's even a higher percentage in the Northeast. There's a very, very small handful, between 1 and 9 in each state of rural farmers of color in the USDA census. So we're building, this land trust idea is really building off of the work of farmers of color who've gone before us. I want to shout out in this moment the New Communities Land Trust because they just celebrated their 50th anniversary. Brilliant. They were like, well, we want land for sharecroppers to be able to, have their own businesses, but we don't really want to own it privately. So they traveled around the world. This is Shirley Sherrod, Slater King. They traveled around the world trying to figure out how land ownership can be done differently. They went to Israel, among other places, studied the kibbutz, and came back and invented the idea of the community land trust, where the land is owned in common, excuse me, and the buildings that are built by the members are actually owned by the person who created them. And so there's this separation of rights, how community land trusts work. And they got 6,000 acres in Albany, Georgia, that was collectively owned by 500 families. They ran a, whole farm. They eventually got bombed by white supremacists, lost their land, but they were part of the lawsuit against federal government, and with their payout, which was higher because they could document the discrimination, they bought land again, which to me, I would quit and go work for the post office, but they started over. So I'm going to talk about the 5 tools that the Land Trust uses, or 6 tools that Land Trust uses. The first is, in relationship to Indigenous people, is a consultation commitment, a right of first refusal, and rematriation. And what that means is that any type of project that's going to happen on the land needs to be run by the council or the government of the Indigenous people who have the rights to that, the ancestral rights to that land. So for us, we're on Mohican territory. So it means when we put our land into a co-op, I went out to the reservation in Wisconsin, met with the council, and talked to them about how they want the land to be used, whether they want to be a co-owner on the land, whether they want an easement, what do they want? And so we're in a cultural respect easement process, which I'll get to, but that's because it's what is asked for by that community. There's this quote here from Liseli Haynes, who actually donated some land to the United Nations as a result of a consultation protocol. The second tool that we use is encouraging people to donate their deeds to the land trust. It's tax deductible, 501c3. So it literally means taking the property and either in someone's will, writing into their will, when I die, it's going to go to the land trust, or actually signing it over. And once the land trust holds the land, we go through our process of Indigenous consultation, seeing if we're going to give those lands to the tribal nation, or if we're going to give out leases to Black farmers or brown farmers in order to use the land. Our aspiration is modest 400 acres of land in the next 10 years. The third tool, and I want to shout out the Sogorea Land Trust for this idea. This is an Indigenous community in the San Francisco Bay Area. They were like, well, if you live on land here, you're already paying taxes to the colonial government, and you're already paying money to your landlord, but you're not paying any money to the Indigenous people whose land was stolen. And so can we convince people of good heart and mind to commit to a tax that goes to Indigenous folks? And in this case, through a 501c3 land trust. And so a similar tool for NEFOC would be to encourage this type of voluntary taxation in order to fund the work. The fourth I mentioned briefly, I'm going to show a video on this, is cultural respect easements. And I need to shout out Ramona Peters, who's Wampanoag and who runs the Native Land Conservancy, for coming up with, or I should say modifying this idea for the Northeast. And you've probably heard of an easement for conservation or an easement for agriculture. It's essentially when a landowner gives up some of their development rights for a higher purpose. Like I have 80 acres, but 60 acres will never be developed so that the bears can roam, right? That's the idea of a conservation easement. A cultural easement allows perpetual access for Indigenous people or another cultural group to use the land for cultural preservation. So our easement, for example, for the Mohican people includes the right to rebury artifacts, the right to hold ceremony, the right to gather wild medicines, to hunt, and to fish. And that is on the deed, so nobody can take it away. And it's this idea of like shared sovereignty, ways of continuing to exist on lands, because granted, some of us may not be in a position to completely give away our homes, but continue to exist on lands and also honor and share. And so I'll show just a quick video about the cultural respect easement that Ramona Peters worked on. If it works.
In Wampanoag, Aki means land. It is something that we are grateful for. In one of our prayers, we say, Manat Ka Nikona Hachik, Creator and Ancestor, thank you for the land. Katapatanamu Wachiwami Aki.
For me, all of Cape Cod has a connection to my ancestors. My folks have been here since this was under a mile of ice.
When you get to sit and you feel the wind and you feel the sun, it is very spiritual. You know that there's a bigger purpose than just for your enjoyment to look at it.
What we put into the land, we get from the land. Our relationship is one of mutual respect.
Yeah, land has its own DNA, and the humans have contributed to that for many thousands of years, and we know a bit about it.
So there is a, there's like a conservation land trust called the Dennis Conservancy that owns a whole bunch of land on Cape Cod. And the laws of the land trust and the conservation easement would exclude the Wampanoag from actually going onto those lands to gather materials, to hold sacred space, to hold ceremony. And so the agreement that they came up with was to allow Wampanoag tribal members to actually use the land for their cultural practices while still keeping it in conservation. And Ramona Peters has been very generous to share these template agreements with our organization and with other organizations. There's a whole project in Maine called the First Light Learning Journey, because Maine, my understanding, is 1/3 of the land is controlled by white-led conservation land trusts, and the entire Wabanaki Confederacy controls about 2% of the land in Maine, which is gross. And so they're doing a learning journey together to figure out how to rectify that injustice. The fifth tool we have is a 2-tiered structure, a little legal mumbo jumbo, but it's important. 501c3s can be vulnerable and they're highly controlled. And so some of the work has been to figure out how to have a 501c3 that can receive land donations, but still have each of the land parcels have its own autonomous control by the people using the land. So there's a subsidiary called a 501c2 that allows many of the benefits of a C3 without some of the governmental oversight and potential for seizure of your land for non-compliance with, private benefit and those kinds of laws. Cooperatives can also be subsidiaries. So that's something we're working on, to have that blend between collectivity and autonomy. And the sixth and final tool I mentioned is personhood of nature. This is deep. I think that we take for granted that in our society, we believe that corporations are people. And they really are. And from a legal standpoint, corporations are people. They have all the rights of an individual and responsibilities. But the idea of rice being a person or a river is something that sounds kind of crazy to many of us. And yet rights of nature is a fundamental component of every indigenous cosmology I've ever studied. I know certainly in Ghana, West Africa, the Queen Mothers there kind of admonished me, because they said farmers in the United States put seeds in the ground and they don't pray or dance or sing or ask permission or say thank you, and they expect the seed to grow. Like, that's why y'all are sick. We're all sick because you treat the earth like a commodity and not like a relative. We see the earth as relative. And in New Zealand, there was a rights of nature where a river was granted personhood, and the Ojibwe people recently granted Manumin, their wild rice, personhood under the law. When we put our land into a co-op, we granted the land personhood, borrowing from both legal frameworks of New Zealand and the Ojibwe people. And what that means in a practical sense, before we do any development on our land, we go through a divination process where we ask the land permission. And if it's a no, it's a no, right? And so I think, that's a big one to start to wrap our heads around. But there are many examples. Ecuador and Bolivia have rights of nature in their constitution. The Ho-Chunk Nation in Wisconsin adopted it. New Zealand, for the river, as I mentioned. In India, there's 2 rivers that have rights of nature, the Himalayan glaciers and Manuman. So I would love to talk a little bit about how your work is contributing to reparations for people whose land and labor was stolen. And because we're short on time and I do have a special guest who's gonna close us out, I'm gonna ask you to pair up again just for a minute and discuss this question, and then we'll come back together. Go ahead, 2 minutes.
I'd like to hear